Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 12 of our reading of Neptune 1 is Missing. It is a novel by Hugh Walters, and as always, we're going to go over the copyright information, which will be displayed on the screen right now, and we're going to go over it. Neptune 1 is Missing is copyright 1969 by Hugh Walters, first American edition, all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portion thereof in any form. So, let's just go back and in the last one, or last part, the people at Control basically given up hope because they hadn't heard anything from the astronauts. What actually happened was that being within Neptune's atmosphere put all the astronauts not in hypothermia, into hypothermia, except a more natural state of it. Anyways, we're going to continue. I don't have very many pages left in this. For a moment, Chris had forgotten what the situation was, but how memory kept seeping in before long, he realized what a desperate position they were all in. Seconds before, he'd felt a delicious lethargy spreading over him, and he'd hoped that he would fall permanently asleep so that Maury and Tony could live. Soon it would be time to defrost them, and for him to have a spell of hypothermia. As always, he had the inner struggle to fight. Should he break his solemn word to the others and sacrifice himself, or must he keep faith and awaken Maury? But what had happened to Serge? Even as he turned to look, the Russian struggled up from the couch. "It's cold," Serge said simply. "So it is," Chris agreed, his mind still occupied with the problem, though having Serge there really left only one choice open to him. He dragged himself weakly towards the HA. "But why had the temperature fallen?" Serge persisted. "Doesn't matter," Chris answered shortly as he switched on to defrost Maury. How he wished he'd never wakened from the delightful inertia he'd felt a little time before. I'll report to Control," the methodical Serge said. "Serge," Chris said suddenly, "have you noticed we're under ion drive?" This was strange. Now he remembered that they had been approaching Neptune and that Control had signaled the chemical motor to begin deceleration. He'd slipped into unconsciousness for a while under the thrust. When he'd come around, he remembered the paralysis that he felt even though they were in free fall. That was not many minutes ago, and now they were traveling along under the steady urging of the atomic motor. It was crazy. Had they gone into orbit around the planet yet? He started out towards the observation post to settle the question. The giant planet would be there in view to confirm that he hadn't lost his senses, but it wasn't. Chris reeled under the shock. The planet was nowhere to be seen, and the star pattern was all wrong. That must be the sun, he gasped to himself in utter amazement. "Serge," he called, "come and look here." The Russian made his way slowly to Chris's side. It seemed that he gazed out into space for a long while before he turned to his companion. "We've been under hypothermia," he announced calmly. Then it came to Chris in a flash. The change in their position could only mean that a considerable time had elapsed, and this in turn confirmed Serge's explanation. Somehow they too had been frozen for a long period. They wouldn't be aware of it, of course, any more than if they had a spell in the quote-unquote fridge. That stiffness that he'd felt, it only seemed minutes, must have been the onset of hypothermia. How it had come about without equipment, he couldn't imagine. His thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of Maury. The American had been defrosted automatically after Chris had set the mechanism going. Chris and Serge burst out with the startling information. "But where are we?" the bewildered Maury asked. "Have you reported to Control?" "I reported half an hour ago. That is," Chris began uncertainly. "It was still too hard to believe that weeks, months might have elapsed since that last call on the AHA. Yes, but without any help from it. It was incredible, a miracle. Wake Tony up, Chris said as he reached for the microphone. Joe Churns. No, Churms. Joe Churms was the young man's name. Joe was on radio watch in control. He'd been given this job, he was sure, because he'd been a few minutes late in arriving for a couple of mornings. It was the dullest job in the whole setup. As he leaned back in the chair, feet up on the powerful receiver, he thought seriously about giving Mr. Gillianders his resignation. It hadn't been his turn to do this It hadn't been his turn to do this hateful chore. Sir George wouldn't have made him do it. He would have understood that a fellow has to have a night out occasionally, and that no one expects him to be on time the next morning. But Mr. Gillianders would listen to no excuses. Since Sir George had been ill, his deputy had been directing the facility. Mr. Gillianders had currently assigned him this watch. Idly, Joe watched the seconds hand of the clock on his instrument panel. Each time the red finger completed its sweep, it was 1 minute nearer the end of his quote-unquote sentence. Only another 89 more, and he'd be able to whip off the earphones. Some other miscreant would take over. He'd no doubt. Good luck to him. Joe had plans. A fellow was entitled to some compensation for the most boring job in the world. Neptune 1 calling control. Neptune 1 calling control. Joe overbalanced and fell to the floor with a clatter. The earphones were snatched from his head. For a second, he thought he'd heard a voice as he sheepishly righted his chair to the grins of fellow technicians. Joe reflected on the trick the human mind can play. For months, they had been listening for a voice from the dead. He'd been on the job for 6 hours with nothing else to do but strain the ears for a sound that never came. Oh well, it had stopped him from falling asleep, which would have landed him in still deeper trouble. The radio operator settled into the chair and began fitting the earphones. Suddenly, the color drained from his face. He jumped up, and his chair went clattering over a second time. Hey, what's come over you? The nearest neighbor called. Feel sick? It's them, Joe managed. What the blazes do you mean? One of the other technicians demanded angrily. You don't joke on this job. It's no joke, Joe insisted, with growing excitement. Listen. He flicked the switch that would bring in the loudspeaker. For by the time most of the people in control were aware that something strange was happening in the radio section. Neptune 1 calling control, came the voice of Chris. Excuse me. With remarkable clarity. One great gasp went up from those scores of men and women that had heard a voice from the dead. Then pandemonium broke loose. Many wept, laughed, danced. It was some minutes before a white-faced Mr. Gillianders managed to restore order. Then he took the microphone. Control calling Neptune 1, he called in a voice that he couldn't recognize as his own. What has happened? We thought you were all dead. How have you survived? Over. In less than 8 minutes, a reply came back. Gosh, we must be close. All in command heard Chris burst out. We don't know what has happened, but we think we've all been under hypothermia. Don't ask me how. Tony and Maury were in the AHA. Surgeon I must have had a dose of it in the cabin somehow. Anyways, we're all alive, but very hungry. A slip of paper was pushed in front of Mr. Gillianders. You're only 37.5 million miles away, he told the distant astronauts. We will have you back in no time. So get a good meal. Even as he spoke, the deputy director knew he was being too optimistic. They still had to work out how to bring the ship in without the help of the lateral jets. Nevertheless, everyone in control and others who came pouring in as the incredible news spread were wild with joy. How much it would all have meant to Sir George Benson. I'm going to tell him, Mr. Gilliander suddenly decided. and get a call into Old Whiskers. This might be just the news that would jerk the director out of the apathy into which he has sunk. It might conceivably be the means of giving him the will to live. In any case, the astronauts had meant so much to him that it was right he should be told. Billy Gillianders left the seething control room and raced to the medical center. There had been little change in Sir George's condition. He still seemed to lack the will to fight for recovery. What was going on in his mind no one knew, not even his closest friends. Some even began to believe that the thrombosis that had so nearly cost him his life had also caused some brain injury. It was heartbreaking to see this once brilliant mind useless and inert. Perhaps it would have been better if he died, Billy had sighed more than once. Now he paused to recover his breath outside the ward in which his chief lay. A tap on the door was quickly answered by the nurse on duty for Sir George had been watched day and night. Recognizing Mr. Gillianders, the nurse beckoned him in. Though he'd visited the chief hundreds of times before, every time Billy saw the still pale figure in the spotless bedclothes, it still upset him. Automatically, he went on tiptoes to the side of the bed. He looked down on his chief, but there was no recognition. So it had been for a long time. He leaned closer. "Benny," he said, speaking very distinctly, "we have had a message from Neptune 1. The crew is still alive." For a moment he thought that his shock treatment would have no effect. He repeated the astounding news. Then, for the first time in months, Sir George Benson showed that he'd heard what had been said. His eyes focused on his friend, and his mouth quivered in a useless effort to speak. "It's true," Billy went on. "Half an hour ago we picked up Chris's voice. Somehow all four had been frozen and had just thawed out." Animation was returning to the director's face as his brain took in Billy's words. It was almost as if a rusty machine, long idle, was at last beginning to work. Billy could have wept for joy to see the chief's mind return from whatever distant place it had been. How far?" Sir George said in a voice hoarse from long disuse. "Under 40 millions, Sir Gillianders told him eagerly. Then his face clouded. "But we still haven't worked out how we can get them down," he admitted soberly. The change that was coming over Sir George Benson was nothing short of miraculous. Every second that passed seemed to bring him more life and strength. He raised himself on an elbow and sipped a drink from a glass beside his bed, something he'd never done before. In a voice becoming continually stronger, he began to question his visitor. Billy answered all the questions very happily, for here was proof that during its long period of inactivity, the brilliant mind of Sir George Benson had not suffered at all. "Nurse," the director declared at last, "get me a dressing gown. I'm going to control." Chapter 18. Though the doctors protested, Sir George was adamant. The only concession he made was that he would travel in a wheelchair. As he tried to stand at the side of his bed, he realized he had no choice. His mind had swung into action, but his body required more time. It was Billy Gillianders himself who triumphantly wheeled in the chief. The scientists had already heard Chris's voice, and the return of their director, too, was like the return of one who had been given up for lost. It spoke volumes for the affection in which they all held for Sir George, that they restrained themselves from flocking around and overwhelming him. Only Dr. Rosenberg and Professor Borinoff came to shake hands almost too vigorously. The warm greeting was interrupted by that amazing phenomenon. Chris's voice from space. Billy pushed the chair across the room, and the radio operator handed over the microphone. With visible emotion, Sir George spoke. "Chris," he said, "Maury, Serge, Tony, this is wonderful. You are all well. I'm sorry I wasn't here when you first came through. I've been on leave, but I'm staying here till we've brought you in." He handed over the microphone. for the effort to speak. The effort of speaking calmly had shown up his weakness. It was better to end his message rather than let his young friends find out how sick he'd been. Now he must wait as patiently as he could for Chris's reply to come back. Meanwhile, data processing from the ship was going on at full speed. Soon they would know if Neptune 1 could be brought into Earth's orbit or whether the miracle had been in vain. It had been agreed that the astronauts should take a good meal if they were going to make a successful landing. Their stocks would be ample, but if this was impossible and Chris had no illusions about it, then neither the conservation of food nor a second miracle could save them. They would want to be in top form, both in mind and body, to give them the best possible chance. Chris or one of the others was sending in data regularly from the ship's instruments, or such of them that were working. It was a great thrill to get the acknowledgement from control so quickly. The crew really felt they were on the homeward stretch. Because they had been so busy and excited, none of them noticed at first that Sir George Benson hadn't yet spoken to them. The idea had only just begun to trouble Chris when the well-known voice spoke. All four of them answered at once. It was marvelous to hear Sir George's voice again, even though distance made it sound a little weaker than it usually was. So he had been on leave. They knew that his devotion to duty could, and often did, drive him on to breaking point. They could imagine what he'd felt during their long silence. A holiday away from the Cape would be fine for him. Even so, they had no doubt that he'd lived, as always, on the end of a telephone. When he got word that Neptune 1 had come through on the radio, they could imagine him tearing back to Cape Kennedy from wherever they'd been. Chris could picture him striding about the control center, barking orders all and sundry. As they sat strapped to their couches eating a substantial meal, Chris turned their situation over in his mind. The ship was streaking towards Earth at a high velocity. The only way it could be decelerated was by firing the atomic and chemical rockets, but their thrust had to be against the ship's line of flight. That meant, of course, that the ship would have to be turned through 180 degrees so that the thrust chambers pointed in the direction they were now moving, and the lateral rockets to do that job were all useless. How, then, could Neptune 1 be made to face this new direction? If all else failed, one of them, and Chris would make sure he did it himself, could go outside the ship to the nose cone. Then a tremendous push would start the ship turning almost imperceptibly. Because of the vast difference between the mass of the ship and his own, Chris would shoot off into space. It would be no use using a safety line, for when it reached the end, the ship would be jerking back again to its former position. Only by allowing himself to go wandering off into space could he make sure that Neptune 1 would slowly turn tail first. Of course, the motors would have to be ignited at precisely the right moment. Otherwise, the ship would go careening off in a new direction, and the situation would be just as bad. The sooner this was done, the better. He must find some excuse to get outside. When he'd set the ship turning, he could tell his friends what he'd done over the helmet radio. Then he would give the order to start up the chemical motor when Neptune 1 was in the right position, but by that time, he himself would be miles away. He'd be doomed to be another article of space debris, but his companions would have been given a chance to live. It seemed ironical that his life had been saved by a miracle, and he was now going to throw it away, but at least it wouldn't have been wasted. 3 of the crew would return safely to the Cape. "Benny, it's great to see you back on your feet," exclaimed the delighted Whiskers. Then, seeing his old friend still in a wheelchair, he added lamely, "Oh, well, you know what I mean." Whiskers had come tearing across the Atlantic the moment he'd heard the wonderful news. It was later rumored that he was halfway across the ocean before he discovered he was still wearing an old pair of bedroom slippers. He'd been shuttled to control from the airstrip by helicopter. His delight at seeing the wonderful recovery of Sir George was matched only by his feeling of wonder that Chris and the others were still alive. Even now, he could hear Maury's slight drawl coming from the loudspeaker. Before long, he was seated at a microphone babbling all sorts of nonsense to his distant friends. It was like old times. He had never thought he'd do this again. Meanwhile, Sir George Benson and his assistants were wrestling with the problem of how to position the ship for the run in without the use of the lateral jets or the gravity of a nearby planet. It seemed an impossible task. Of course, Earth's gravity would eventually pull the heavier tail around in the right direction, but this would be much too late to decelerate Neptune 1. The same solution that Chris had reached also crossed the director's mind, but it was premature even to think about it yet. They still had a few hours in which to work out an alternative. Neptune 1 calling control. I'm going to make an external examination of the ship. We'll report any meteorite damage to casing later. It was Chris's voice, and it roused the director from his thoughts. Of course, the outer casing must be examined carefully. After those long months during which the ship had been crossing space, it must have encountered countless fragments of space dust. Most would be far too small to see, but a few might be larger. It was these latter, even though they were smaller than a grain of sand, that would do the damage. Because of their very high velocity, they would vaporize immediately when they struck the ship, at the same time vaporizing a minute amount of the outer casing. A number landing in the same spot could even penetrate the protective layers, and this would expose the ship when it entered denser meteor clouds near the Earth. But why was Chris going outside to make the inspection? It was Tony's job, and he was the expert. He had often had to patch a damaged section during a flight. Chris was no mechanic, so why was he going to do the job? Tony was all right after his long sleep. Chris had said so. He'd sounded well enough each time he'd spoken. So why wasn't he doing the inspection? No, it couldn't be, but it might. Sir George hadn't been a close friend of Chris for some years without gaining an insight into how his mind worked. He had little doubt that Chris would think of this method of turning the ship, and knowing Chris, he'd no doubt who would do the job. Should he order his friend to remain inside? The director had thought. With the glorious news of the survival of the Neptune crew, had reawakened his will to live, that he would never again have to make a life and death decision. Yet here, within the space of hours, while he still wasn't fit to leave his wheelchair, this new problem was thrust upon him. Without doubt, unless the ship could be turned, all 4 astronauts would be lost. All 4 astronauts would be lost. If Chris was going to make the sacrifice that Sir George thought he was, then 3 of them might be saved. No, he couldn't do it. He couldn't jeopardize his chance of recovering 3 of the crew because of his affection for the 4th member. He must pretend to take Chris's message at face value. His only comfort was that in any case, it was probably too late to veto Chris's intention. Even now, he might well be outside the ship, and no amount of orders, threats, or cajoling would persuade him to return. Sir George felt his pulse racing and his head begin to swim as the old tension built up once more. He struggled to get a grip on himself. There was only one thing to do, and that must be done quickly. He went over to the transmitter and spoke urgently. Control calling Neptune 1. Chris, you are to delay inspection for a time. You are to report if any of your jet guns are working. This is urgent. Report if your jet guns are working. Over. It was a chance in 1,000 that there might still be some pressure left in one or other of the little guns that the astronauts used to propel themselves when out in space. If there was, then they could be used to set the ship turning instead of the push that would send Chris off into the void. Though he hadn't revealed his thoughts to any of his colleagues, they could see that something had upset Sir George. His face had gotten very drawn, and Whiskers and Mr. Gilliander sensed that he was near a relapse. His hand was shaking visibly when he held the microphone. They stood by him with growing anxiety. We're going to have to stop that here for now. We have been reading Neptune 1 is Missing, a novel by Hugh Walters. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, or if you want to join the Discord server, then all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.